started. Quick introduction. So, Natalie Giazzo, Ganawioke Koyukono Nodage. I am Natalie. I come from Oklahoma Cayuga people. I do language revitalization work in my communities. I'm going to give you all prayer tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my camera. I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to say it again, but in English, and then we'll just kind of keep going forward. But we want to make sure we just open it in a good way for all the good discussion that we're going to be having happening tonight. So. Swagwego, Swadosios, Nigai Huaka. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Owisoa. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Etinoha Owijade. Dead Wadanahonyo. Ha Dewenyo Rage Onoguatra ni. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Wayani Yota. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Adehodoni. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Gadinyo. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Ogaonyo. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Gyoheko. Dead Wadanahonyo ne Deyowa Wenye. Te Yatanahonyo ne Tisot Hadewanodagias. Des Wadanahonyo ne Sedwagia Edeka Kaguakies. Te Yatanahonyo ne Etisota Soheka Etnidagies. Te Yatanahonyo ne Ojasodagia. Te Yatanahonyo ne Kie Nioguadage Hariongehono. Des Wadanahonyo ne Songwaedison. Daneto Nagakweni Ige Agaya Gandak Ganodhonyo. Daneto. Everyone listen for a little while. The people, we greet each other. We will give thanks to our mother, the earth. We will give thanks to the weeds and medicines. We will give thanks to the hanging fruits. We will give thanks to the trees. We will give thanks to the animals. We will give thanks to our waters. We will give thanks to our sustenance, and we will give thanks to our stirring winds. We will give thanks to our grandfathers, the thunderers. We will give thanks to him, our elder brother, sun, and we will give thanks to our grandmother, moon. We will give thanks to the stars. We will give thanks to the four heavenly beings. We will give thanks to him, our creator. And that is all for which I am giving thanks today. Down it. That is all. Okay, everyone. So thank you for attending day 2 of this year's Blue Jay Festival. I'm very excited tonight to introduce to you Gerard Miller. They will be telling us stories tonight. And after these stories, we will facilitate a conversation around identities and also just have some good old fun, because laughter is the best medicine for these kinds of discussions and these kinds of stories. And just to remind y'all, Blue Jay is Na'alihi Fund's annual autumn event. We do this for art, community, culture, and connection. If you have any more questions on what's going to be going on, I'll put the Blue Jay schedule in the chat. We also have an event sponsor for the first time, so thank you to the Seattle Foundation for their help in putting this on. So yeah, we're going to listen to some stories. We're going to have some good discussions. Be sure to keep your ears open and your hearts open, and give it up for Gerard Miller.
Thank you, Shki. Osionigada, Gerard Miller, Ale Chisqua Dawodo, Ani Chalagi, Digega, Ani Tuscarora, Ale Haliwasaponi, Digega, Ani Gayaleno, Ale Maryland, Digega. Hello, everyone. My name is Gerard Miller. I am descended from Cherokee people, Tuscarora, Haliwasaponi, and other people from North Carolina and Maryland. I greet you, everyone, today. I'm going to tell this story within a story with my camera off to make myself less nervous. But I hope you can all settle in, enjoy. As Natalie said, get your water, get your blanket, and listen with me. One day, not that long ago, Kananeshki, the spider, was sitting by the front door of her lodge, weaving and worrying. In the morning, she had gone to water, greeting Unelplanahi, Creator, in the seven directions. She prayed for long life and health for her family. But as she spoke her words, she saw a single black feather that had fallen from Raven's tail and was floating slowly past her. Excited, she ran home calling, "My cousin is coming! My cousin is coming!" She busied herself with cleaning her around her yard, sweeping the house, making bean bread and willow tea. It had been so long since she'd seen him, the one they call Nancy. She wanted everything to be just right. So once her table was set and the jars filled with water, she sat by her door, weaving and worrying. In the distance, she could hear singing. The giddy music was so sweet it distracted her, and Kononeshki missed a few notches on her basket. She decided she'd fuss about that later and stood up to listen for the call. "Abo!" Anansi cried out in fear. "Amen!" Kananeshki replied. "Abo! Are you listening?" "Amen! I hear you." At the end of her yard, Kananeshki saw Anansi singing and sashaying his way toward her. He was quite a short fellow, but somehow when you looked at him, it seemed as if he could be 8 feet tall. His black face shone with the smile he wore, and his fine silk shirt sparkled in the breeze. "Osio Gusti," she greeted. "Hello, cousin." "Osio Tohichu." "Hello, how are you?" he replied, making the effort to speak Chalagi as a show of respect for his cousin in her home. "Tohiku Shki." "I'm well, thank you." "Mihina, and you?" "Osiku." "I'm okay," Anansi said. "Come, be welcome. You've traveled such a long way." Kananeshki handed him a bowl of water to wash his hands and face and offered him a seat. As he sank down into the chair, Anansi offered her a gourd that he'd been hanging from his waist. "Palm wine from my own trees. Made it myself. It's the last of what I brought from home." "Thank you. The way you were singing, I guess you had some along the way," Kananeshki teased, while bringing the jug of water and bread close. She lit her pipe as she sat. "Oh, that? Hey, I was just remembering old times, and it made me glad. Did I ever tell you about the time I tried to keep all the wisdom in the world to myself?" "Oh, Tla, no," Kananeshki said. "How does it go?" Well, chamu chamu yet. Talk some, leave some. Way back when Yami, creator, made wisdom, he trusted me with handing it out," Anansi said proudly. "I was supposed to get everyone a little piece until each one had just enough for themselves. So there I go with this big calabash, dipping into it and pouring out a little bit of wisdom into leopard's cup, a little nip into rabbits, eagles. Up and down I go all day, up and down. Can't see in the morning to can't see at night. Handing out wisdom. Hard work." Uh-huh, Kananeshki affirmed as she handed her pipe to her cousin. "And we all know how you feel about that." Squinting, fake offended at the remark, Anansi continued, "Anyway, by the time I get home, I see that there's just enough wisdom left in the calabash for me. I start thinking about all of that wisdom I gave away and how I started the day with so much. So I get to thinking, why should I be left with so little when I did all the work?" I asked my wife about it, and she says, "Use what you got to get what you want." I sleep on it, and when I wake up, I know what to do. I take the little bit of wisdom I have left and I mix it in the pot where I'm dyeing my thread. I spin it thin, 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 and it comes out the softest, shiniest silver. Finest silk I've ever made. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm, Kananeshki replied. So I takes my thread and I weave it into these long strips. And I go from house to house. I greet each person and I say, I'll trade you this cloth for that wisdom I gave you yesterday. Now, naturally, every single one of them looks at me and says, now, why would I trade that little bitty cloth for the wisdom Yami made himself? But I've already got that covered. So I say, you know the saying, save the best for last? Well, I gave you some pretty good wisdom, but I saved the best for myself. When I got home, I made this cloth. See how fine that is? How delicate? Give me that wisdom I gave you, and you can have it all to yourself. And did they buy it? Kananeshki asked. Well, of course. I go to rabbit, I go to toad, I go to leopard. I even climb up and talk to eagle again. And everywhere I go, I get the wisdom and I leave the silk. So it gets to be the end of the day again, and I've got a calabash full of wisdom all over again. But then I get to worry that somebody will start talking. And when people start talking, they start wondering. And when they start wondering, they get to thinking. And I just figured that by and by, they'd figure me out. So again, I asked my wife what to do. And she says, heart can't want what the eye can't see. Again, I sleep on it, and I sleep hard. When I wake up, the sun's already high in the sky, but I know what I've got to do. I get that calabash of wisdom and I sling it across my shoulder so it sits on my chest. I go to my tallest palm tree because I want to hide the gourd among the leaves. With the calabash on my front, I can't get my arms around the tree. So I shift it over, but it starts to dig in my side. Finally, I get it over onto my back and I start to climb. But see, the higher up I get, the harder the wind blows. And the harder the wind blows, the more the tree sways. And as the tree sways and all the wisdom in the calabash moves and splashes around and makes the weight uneasy, I get all the way up to the tippy, tippy top. And just when I'm about to take the calabash off my back, this big gust of wind comes through and knocks me back. The weight of all that wisdom sloshes around and pops the top off that calabash. To my utter horror, the gourd tips over into the wind and all of that wisdom pours out. I watch as it spreads out and covers the world, covers the whole world. I look in the gourd and there's just enough left in it for me. To this day, there's wisdom everywhere. Everyone has a little and can gather more. And my silk is still hung in every house. Oh, wow. All right. Kanoheloshki Wodohi. Beautiful story, Kananeshki says. She applauded. Took a lot of wisdom for you to figure that out. Most folks aren't as crafty as we are. It reminds me of the time I captured fire. You remember that one? Darby? No. How did it happen? Well, you know, Kananeshki says, long, long ago, when Unetlanahi, creator, first made the world, all the fire stayed up in the sky. It was fine during the day because the sun would light up the world and keep us warm and dry our clothes. And on nights when the moon was bright, we could still see our paths and navigate by its light. For some of us, it even made hunting easier. My traps glittered, so I could see them, but all sorts of moths and flies that weren't as good as seeing in the dark, got caught. Owl would fly around as she hunted, and you wouldn't hear anything but a rush of wings as she landed. And we could tell the days by the phases of the moon and the movement of the stars. But on nights when there was no moon, and when the clouds hid the stars, it was hard. There was no way to see. Folks would bump into each other and knock things over. There'd be arguments, and some didn't go so well. People would get lost in the woods, especially if they were traveling away from home. It would get very, very cold. And even those with big coats would shiver until their teeth chattered. And it was worse when it rained. Everything would be wet for days, days. It ruined clothes, made the roofs of houses so heavy that some collapsed, and the cold would get so that it would sink into your bones. One day, after suffering this way for a long, long time, Yona, bear, called a council meeting. He asked Chistu, rabbit, to go from house to house to make sure that everyone would be there. On the next full moon, everyone arrived at the council house. Yona, with his big, beautiful black fur covering his feet to his snout. Golana, raven, with his gleaming white feathers that shone with the colors of the rainbow. Inada, snake, with her bright, smooth skin like pearls. I walked in and found a quiet corner to hear what would be said. Bear greeted everyone in their turn, then got down to business. We all know how bad things can get in the dark, Yona said. It's cold and miserable, and it's just too much. I brought you all here because I might have a solution. Chula, fox, told me that during the last thunderstorm, they saw a piece of lightning strike a big hollow oak tree out in the middle of the river. She said that where it landed, a flower grew that looks like the sun. It gives off heat, and it dried out everything around it. It's stuck down in the hollow of the tree, but if we get it out, it can make the darkness easier to survive. He used the oyster. Is this a good thing? We all agreed that it was a good thing. But then the problem was figuring out how to get that flower. Yona, bear, of course, being the head of the council, offered to go first. Because he was the biggest and the strongest and thought himself the bravest, he refused to let anyone try it ahead of him. So we all walked to the edge of the river to watch Yona fetch the flower. He waded across the water to the base of that tree and walked up to look into the hollow. There he saw the flower, with its bright light and warmth cast on everything. Yona figured he could just reach in and grab it with his mouth and bring it back. But when he got his mouth close to it, the hair on his snout started burning. Ah! He yelled in pain and surprise. He pulled back his snout and saw some of the flour stuck to the hair. He went to put his wet hands on his nose, but those started burning too. He flailed and whimpered and finally ran back into the water. When he got to the other side and waded out, we could see that he'd lost the hair on his nose and his palms. To this day, black bears don't have a lot of hair on their noses and don't have much on their palms either. Next, Golana, raven, who figured he could fly down into the hollow and scoop up the flower in his claws, since he didn't have any hair to burn. So he set off across the water and hovered above the tree. He dove down into it. Just as he got his talons around the flower, the heat of it scorched his feet. He yelped in shock and was forced to let go. Limping toward it, he thought he might be able to grab it with his bright white beak since there wasn't even skin there. So he reached out to grab the flower, but it burned his beak. He cawed in alarm, flapped his wings to get up and out of the hollow of the tree, but all of his flapping threw dust and soot and seemed to make the flower grow. So, afraid of getting stuck, he flew up and out of the hollow. And as he did so, the soot and smoke coated his feathers. When he landed back on the shore, he looked defeated. I mentioned that he had dust in his feathers, and he went to wash them off, but the color remained as deep and dark as his feet and his beak. Having watched them struggle, Inada, snake, clicked her tongue and shook her head. I can do this better, she said. So she slithered down into the water and up into a crack in the tree. She had the idea of wetting her back and grabbing the flower from underneath. So up she went into the hollow. But as she made a circle around the base of the flower, her skin began to get warm. The water quickly dried out, and her skin began to as well. Inanda kept circling, trying to get closer to the flower, but the closer she got, the greater the heat. Finally, she gave up, slithered back into the water, and made her way to land. When she got back, we all saw that though her belly was still light, it was a little dull, and her back had cracked into scales. One by one, every creature had their turn at trying to retrieve this thing. Once everyone had gone, I stepped forward. I think I figured this out, I said. Most didn't even try to hide their surprise. Even Yona, the big bear, laughed at me. You're so small. How could you possibly do it if none of us could? Not even me. Watch and see, I said. I took some clay from the edge of the river and made a little ball of it that I lifted to my head as I skipped across the water. When I had made it to the base of the tree, I took the clay and made it into a little bowl. I had noticed that the flowers seemed to be growing through a piece of wood, and I figured I could get just a bit of the root if I broke a piece of that off. So I snapped off just a bit of the tree bark, and sure enough, a bit of the flower came with it. I settled it down into the little bowl I made and put that on my back. I swam as fast as I could back across the river. I didn't want to burn my back, and I didn't want the flower to fall into the water. When I made it back to shore, I took the bowl from my back and presented it to Yona. Over time, we figured out how to grow and spread that flower in a way that we could use it and not be hurt. Today we call it achila, fire. Ooh, said Anansi. Now that is a story. And it went that way as Kananeshki and Anansi sat down to dinner, trading stories about how Rabbit lost the rest of his tail, about why Owl looks that way, about why Beaver's tail is flat. Story after story, deep into the night. They shared food and smoke. Kananeshki even pulled out some old strawberry wine she'd been saving for just such an occasion. The cousins talked long into the night and into the early dawn. The next day, they spoke of other things. As Kananeshki finished her basket, Anansi worked on a blanket he'd brought with him. You know, said Anansi, they don't tell these stories as much anymore. Not since my people got here. They don't even weave like they used to. And fewer people speak to me when I pass, or even know what to say. It's the same for me, said Kananeshki. Only so many baskets left, and some don't even remember the word for fire. What shall we do, cousin? Asked the African. Continue to talk story, said the Indian. Weave them together into blanket and basket and song, and hope the children speak of us again.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Gerard. I'm really struck, actually. I did the Sovereign Futures panel today, and there was um, there was a member of the cohort who was there, and they said that their grandma always told them, corn comes in every color, right? Red, white, black, purple. So just the way that ended really reminded me of that, and I wanted to share that with you all today. Um, so actually, this was wonderful listening to these stories that you just told us. Um, and I know you gave us a little bit in the beginning, but part of this conversation is about identity. So if you'd like to elaborate a little more on who you are and what identities you hold, and maybe what traditions the stories that you've told us come from too, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So I am African American with roots in Maryland and North Carolina, as I said. My mother's side is Chalagi, Cherokee, and we also have relatives among the Ohalawa, Tuscarora, and other folks in and around North Carolina. The characters are in the story are Kananeshki, the Cherokee spider grandmother. And that is it's a take on a traditional Cherokee story of how fire was captured. And credit is given to the water spider when no other creature could. The character of Anansi comes from West Africa, from what is now Ivory Coast, Ghana, parts of Burkina Faso, the Akan people, and their language of Twi. Oh, well, it's Akan, but the Ghanaian version, Asante, they call it Twi. And that is a pretty well-known story about Anansi and the Gourd of Wisdom. There was a Wishbone episode about it some years ago, so it's one of my favorites. The longer form story, like his son has a part in it. His wife is just at a loss of what to do with her husband, who just can't stop himself. But I chose, or I didn't even choose. I sat with like, what story would I tell at an event like Blue Jay Brings Back the Moon? And I thought about the stories I shared last year, and one of the things that came to me the strongest this time was memory, and how much of our identities are contained in the stories that we tell about ourselves, about our past, whether it's directly a folk tale, like we would call these, stories of our specific family, stories from recent history, and then what it means when our traditions aren't carried forward. Cherokee language is endangered because of a host of factors. And language is one of the many cultural effects that was systematically stripped from African people as they were brought to this continent during the transatlantic slave trade. And so the idea of memory is really strong. And the fact that both of these cultures, which are, I would dare to say, two of the most well-known cultures as far as the wider world, people know aspects of Akan culture, be it the Anansi stories, be it kente cloth, be it some of the song and dance traditions. People know Cherokee. It's one of those names where if somebody says Native American or Indigenous American, like it's in the top I don't want to anger anybody, but it's in, for a lot of people, it's in the top 10, let's say. And yet, there's not a lot of people who get into the heart of what it means to carry story forward. For my family and families like mine, it gets even tougher because we are caught between styles of racism, styles of oppression. Among the so-called 5 civilized tribes, there was a healthy slave trade, which included trafficking of captive Africans. But in the eyes of the Europeans who came over, the Chalagi, the Anigidua were a nuisance, amongst others. They were in the way of the gold that was in the land or anything else that they could extract. The Africans often found themselves halfway between, and then at a certain time, especially when it became time for tribal enrollment and the censuses that were taken, I hate that word, who counted as what to the American establishment really made a difference. So for families like mine who were of mixed heritage, more often than not, if you looked too brown, you got immediately classified in a certain way that negated your American indigeneity. Coupled with the fact that in order to keep themselves safe and as a means of self-preservation, a lot of nations created their own internal standards that further isolated and marginalized people of African descent. And so I thought about what would happen if 2 of our classic wisdom figures, if 2 of our classic tricksters, because wisdom and trickery are 2 sides of the same coin, I'd say that Kananeshki more fully embodies wisdom, and Anansi more usually embodies mischievousness. But if they got together and talked about how things are and what we could gain from sharing story with one another, reaching into our shared history, our commonalities, not just in oppression, but also in what we bring from our own cultures outside of a context of oppression.
I really love what you said about bringing the figures together and having them have this conversation, right? Because, sometimes when we hear stories, or at least I've felt this way before, you want to keep the original story. You want to keep the story that you heard, and you're like, oh, that's it, that's everything. But the beauty of it is that stories are always being invented. You get to tell your own story. And this is what it has been for you, it sounds like.
Yeah.
I do want to open up to everyone else and have you guys, if you have any questions, do drop them in the chat. But I have one more question to give you guys some time to think about that. So I have never personally heard stories being told inside stories and having a little multitude of them like that. And, understanding those 2 tricksters coming together, I guess it kind of makes sense why we would have stories within stories. But was that kind of your thought process? You're having these characters together and you maybe want to develop a little bit and have them tell these stories in stories, or is that just something new you wanted to try out, or how'd that come about?
It came about, it was the first thing you said, what would happen? What would they tell? And it really started with looking at which characters are common between Africa and Indigenous America. So there's spider, there's rabbit. There's not bears in Africa, there are panthers. And before, up until, what was it, 1955, there were still Eastern cougars. No, it was like 65. Yeah, there were still cougars in the Eastern United States. So would have been in Appalachians. So there was panther or cougar or leopard or whoever you call them. I said spider, rabbit. There was turtle. There was snake. There was eagle. There was crow or raven. And so in looking at these characters, I'm like, who would talk and not argue? Who would talk and not fight? Like they might needle about the specific points, but who could have a deep but lighthearted conversation? I was like, it would be spider. And we have what traditions go with spiders, and that lend themselves to story. Weaving. Who weaves? Well, we have Cherokee basket making, basket weaving traditions, cloth weaving traditions. There is deep history of both basket and cloth weaving in West Africa. And spider, especially with the fabric, is credited in Ghana with teaching people how to weave. And like the thing about the silk, kente cloth was originally made from silk. It was a very like high quality thing. And there are some, and also in most cultures, like the traditional weaving patterns often carry meaning. So there are codes and stories within the pattern of the cloth. And so if Kananeshki is weaving her basket in certain patterns and is telling stories through that. And then Anansi is weaving his cloth. And in this case, he's not making kente because they're in the United States. And so he's making a quilt. And so he's carrying over the same tradition of strips of fabric brought together to make a wider cloth. But here, that's a quilt. That's not the same kinds of indigenous fabrics that they have in Africa. So it's like, who would talk? What would they talk about? How would they get their point across? And like, where could they meet? And they are cut like evolutionary history. They are cousins, right? A spider is a spider. Eventually, you go back on the, what do they call it? The phylogenetic tree. You go back far enough, they have a common ancestor. So they're cousins. But they've grown in these separate cultures. And so their stories are different. That's why it's, have you heard about the time that I got the wisdom? Well, no. Have you heard about the time that I got fire? No. They're both spiders, but their stories are different because the people that they grew with are different. But they're still relatives. They're still they're still relatives.
They can still cross over and see each other and tell those stories together.
Exactly.
I like those metaphors of weaving too. You weaved in and out. Mm-hmm.
And they can learn technique from each other. That's what I was going to say. They can, which is what the people did when able.
Mm-hmm. And I especially like that bit about in the beginning when she was working on the basket, she's like, oh, I'll get to that, you know?
I'm going to fuss him out about this later, yeah.
Yeah. Very relatable sayings as well. I actually wrote one of them down. Was it people go from talking to wonder into thinking, or thinking to talking, or thinking to wonder into talking?
Yeah.
I like that a lot. I was like, wow, that really is true. I hope that's what'll happen in this group, folks. Let's come back.
The last thing I was going to say is, nope, never mind.
No, it's gone.
Fled.
Well, if it's important, it come back. Oh,
the how they greeted one another and what each of them had prepared. So Anansi greets originally Kananeshki in his own language to say, I'm here. And she replies in his language, like she honors his greeting in his words. But then when he gets to her house, they speak in her language. And so he honors that, knowing the importance of of language, he's like, I'm in your house, I'm going to do my best to speak in your way. And he brought, you don't show up to somebody's house empty-handed. So he brought palm wine, some of his best. She had cleaned the house. She had water because she knows that in his tradition, especially with your hands. And so when you're greeted, if you're going to sit down to a meal and a conversation, you're going to wash your hands and your face to be able to eat. She had water and tobacco for him. And they then shared strawberry wine later. Like it was this complex, like
it was this
reciprocity.
Both
rooted in their own indigenous custom, but respectful and woven into each other to make this experience. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm really glad that you provided that context. I personally didn't grow up with Cherokee tales. I grew up with different ones, but that's the beauty of hearing all of these tales. Once you are able to hear one from a storyteller, you're able to just understand who they are and what their cultures are just a little bit better.
I didn't grow up with these in my family either. I had to find them in community. Robert Lewis, I credit with a lot of the stories that I know.
Do you have any other storytelling inspirations?
I grew up doing African drum and dance. And so I can call Mama Kabibi Ajanku, Mama Cheryl Hinton, Hassan Conte, Baba Kuuna Mujamal, Mama Brenda Brown. Like there's a lot of, I grew up in that, in that nest of story, dance, and song.
Oh, I love that. I used to know how to call folk dancing, and it's really hard to be a good caller. So hearing you list it off was just great. So do you find that music ever winds its way into your stories? Have you ever thought about incorporating it?
I have productions that live in my head. And my partner can tell you that I collect instruments. And perhaps once the pandemic is over, they can be given life.
Ooh, I'm really excited for that then. What would that be exactly? Or is it still under wraps? Is it still?
It could be similar to this, but if a Nazi is walking down the road singing on his way to his cousin's house, what is he singing? And does she join in? Or does she greet him in a song in return? Like, what is a lot of songs, a lot of stories are sung. Maybe she invites him to a dance, and that's a whole nother layer of commonalities, but the circle dance is something that is very much common among Southeastern Woodlands, Indigenous folks and folks in West and Central West Africa. In the Gullah Geechee Nation nowadays, we talk about the folks talk about the ring shout. We talk about their ring shout. But that commonality is moving counterclockwise around the circle, which was around the fire, which was around the tent pole or the Sundance pole or whatever
the longhouse.
The longhouse. Yeah. Exactly. We go, which is the same direction that the Milky Way moves, and all of these. Yeah, I could go on, but I want to hear if folks have questions.
Oh, we have a comment from YouTube from Asia Tail. Thank you, Wado, for the powerful stories and words. What books or resources would you recommend for learning more Cherokee stories?
I don't have a book to recommend. If you look on YouTube, I think, and I was saying to a friend the other day, I think the best way to get a sense of traditional stories, their patterns and what they contain, is to listen to them as their oral traditions. So if it's possible, automatic lights. If it's possible to listen, and YouTube also provides transcripts, the closed captions, if you're unable to listen. But like I said, Robert Lewis, there, if you type in, I would use the word Tsalagi. It's Tsalagi. It's the name of the language of people in the language that will commonly use in the language. If you search Cherokee, you'll get a lot of stuff. Lots of stuff. Like I said, it's a popular name. But Cherokee storytelling, there are things that are put up by the Cherokee Nation, North Carolina, sorry, in Oklahoma, by the Eastern Band of Cherokee in North Carolina. The Anadisco, which is the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, they have things on their website. So there's things out there. I'd say if you search Cherokee Story Robert Lewis and then see what they pop up, you'll get a lot of hits.
Sounds like he was a prolific storyteller. Was he associated in Oklahoma or in North
He's in
Carolina?
Oklahoma, yeah. I think he's from Tahlequah.
Okay, wonderful. I'm wearing my Oklahoma shirt. Y'all can't see it, but yeah, Oklahomies. No, but you're based out of, or your roots are in North Carolina.
North Carolina,
correct?
yeah.
Wonderful.
Gayaleno Digega.
Very nice. It's still fun to meet your cultural relatives, no matter where you go.
Far and away, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other comments or questions?
See if anyone else want to pipe up. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Speak now, write it in the comments.
Mm-hmm. Or feel free to write it in the comments, of course, too. Oh, this is really good, Gerard. Actually, this reminds me. I grew up with an anthology of stories, and it was a collection of stories. Now I'm like trying to remember it from when I was a little kid because this is so long ago. Mm-hmm. But so it had a collection of stories and it included like Algonquin stories. Yes, thank you, Mash, for joining us, and thank you, May. But so I had Algonquin stories, and then it had historical stories, so like regarding, let's say, the building of the railroads, and then it had another motif, Brer Rabbit stories. Mm-hmm. And I remember Brer Rabbit being like just always a hoot, first of all. Do you have any plans, or do you know any Brer Rabbit stories you were thinking about including in the future?
So Brer Rabbit is exactly one of those things that is a good fusion of African and Indigenous American traditions. Because like I said, there's rabbit figures in Africa, and most of the Brer Rabbit stories actually come from the African tradition, and were blended in Appalachia. And then you get into the whole like Uncle Remus crap, because those stories from both sides were taken and turned into minstrel traditions and stuff to crack fun at the people who didn't have a choice. But yes, a lot of Brer Rabbit stories. The thing about rabbit is, especially in the African-American telling, is a trickster for survival. The same way that Peter Rabbit plays the role in the English, but it's like Brer Rabbit gets over on the man in charge, or the biggest, strongest thing. Brer Rabbit is not necessarily the strongest, but he's the smartest. He may not be the biggest, but because he's small, he can maneuver in and out, right? He lives in the briar patch because it's protected, and he can get in, tunnel down, and it will protect him, where somebody trying to get at him will get hurt. So it's a lot of that cunning survivalism under oppression. What do you do when you're not the biggest, strongest, most powerful, and folks are coming at you all the time? A rabbit is a prey species.
Would you almost say like an underdog in a way?
Yeah, very much. Very much the triumphant underdog.
Mm-hmm. Are there any particular underdog motifs in Cherokee stories or any other cultures that
So
you're familiar with?
again, with rabbit, cheese stew. Um, there's a story about listening to the least among you. And like, because in the council house, everybody's talking. Yona Bear's leading the way. They're trying to solve some problem. And oh well, you shouldn't. Well, and everybody has their say. And Rabbit keeps trying to cut in and say, "I know the answer. I know the answer." And they're like, "Rabbit, I know the answer. I know that. Rabbit, get out." So he's like, "Fine. You don't want to hear it. I'm gonna go out." They're like, we don't want to hear. Like he's trying to sing this song. It's like, we don't want to sing your song right now. We're trying to do this council business. So they either put him out or he leaves offended, depending on the telling. But he won't stop singing. So he's like out there shaking his rattle, singing his song, saying his name. Da, 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 da. Finally, it comes time, and they need a solution, and they've run out of ideas. Somebody, usually Yona, happens to hear that daggone rabbit. What is it that you said? No, you didn't want to listen to me before. No, no, no. So now Yona has to like coax and beg Chistu to tell him what he had to say. So it's those sorts of things.
Oh, I love that. Actually, we have one more question. I like this one. I want you to be able to answer it too. What is a story that has really impacted you? You could pick two if two come to mind. I know it's a hard ask.
Story that has really impacted me.
Mm-hmm.
I really like creation stories that get into how the world was made, because it shows you how people thought, what they found important. And so, like, for instance, part of the, which part? Yeah. So creation stories are deep, right? There's many facets. But one part, for instance, I could pull out is like Western European culture sees vultures as a bad thing, right? They don't like buzzards. They went out and have killed so many that now, say in Southern Africa and East Africa in the Rift Valley, there are issues with disease, with like animal diseases and populations, because and actually here in the States too, vultures we don't have as many of because of urban development and people shooting them thinking they're a pest species. But they're not around to eat up the carcasses and, put through that life cycle, that regenerative cycle. So you have a lot of waste. Animals die by water and spoil the water. It kills other animals. It makes, water bad for humans to drink. Like there's this whole thing. But part of the Cherokee creation story is that it was buzzard, it was vulture flying over the mud of the world. Right? The world was water and mud, as in most, as in many, I'm not going to say most, as in many creation stories. The earth was mostly water. There was a little bit of mud, maybe a little speck, a little island or whatever, piece of clay that was dropped. And it was said that vulture's flight, as he flew, where he dropped his wings down, carved out the valleys, and where he swung his wings up, threw up the mountains. And that's how we get the Smoky Mountains in what is now North Carolina, Tennessee area. And that is that's home territory, and that's how it was made. Was this? And so you look at the same creature, and to one culture, to that of the colonizer settler, that's a pest species. And to these people, this is the creature that created the land that you stand on. So you have to honor them. So yeah, it's all stories are impactful to me, but that's one great example of like how the stories that you tell, both about yourselves, about origins or whatever, shape the way that you see the world.
I just want to sit with that now. Like, wow, thank you.
There's a longer, more beautiful version that you can find on YouTube, I'm sure.
There always is, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Gerard, for joining us. I'm looking at time now, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, yours included. So wow, thank you everyone for joining us for this storytelling hour and this talk about what is identity? How do we present our identities? How does that show up in the stories we tell? And this was really enlightening. So thank you, Gerard.
Thank you, Ashki.
So if you would like to learn more about Na'ilihi Fund for anyone who's joining us, just go ahead and visit our website at na'ilihi.org. You can check out other Blue Jay Festival events this week on our website through our scheduling page. Tomorrow at noon Pacific, we will have a Beaters social. So on the Beaters, I hope to see you there. Oh, and we have Gerard's website, alteredroots.com. Thank you very much. And yeah, and then tomorrow evening, we're actually going to have an interactive story as told by a pre-recorded video from Eats a Sash. So all my singers, all my dancers, all my drummers, I hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.